Hello everyone, and welcome back. Unsolved mysteries are something that I find absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure if you found your way to this video, you at least somewhat feel the same way. There's just something about the unknown that is absolutely fascinating, especially when it comes to unsolved cases. Sometimes it's as simple as it's practically proven, as in all the facts point to one thing, but there's just one little thing that means they can't officially prove it on paper. So with some true crime cases, even though you likely know who did it, and everyone who's looked into that case pretty well agrees so-and-so did it, there's just not that final little bit of proof to finally connect the dots. But other times, cases have little, if any, dots to connect at all. There's little to no leads, there's a lack of evidence, or maybe something went wrong in the investigation, or maybe time and science just weren't on the side of the crime or mystery in question. These cases are as cold as it gets, and those are the ones I find the most interesting, as all there really is to do is speculate. And today I wanted to take a look at 3 unsolved mysteries, ranging anywhere from true crime to just a weird thing that happened and we don't really know why or who or, anything like that. And so without wasting too much time, let's dive into it. The first cold case I want to talk about today is the case of Jeanette DePalma. This is a cold case that largely revolves around the occult, but as we'll dive into, that is sort of wrongly attributed to this, but we'll get into that here in a bit. Jeanette DePalma was born August 3rd, 1965, to parents Florence and Salvador DePalma. Her family consisted of her parents, and 7 siblings. The DePalmas lived in Springfield, New Jersey, and were devout Catholics. For the most part, the DePalma family kept to themselves. Now, that's not to say that they were recluse or antisocial or anything along those lines. It's just to say they didn't really butt into other people's business, and for whatever reason, though very few, it is worth mentioning, very few thought this, it is reported that some thought the DePalmas thought they were too good for everyone else, and therefore some people didn't like them, for stupid reasons. But for the most part, the DePalmas' relationships with everyone were fine. It was just those few odd interactions that, made people not like them for whatever reason, because they wanted to come home after a long day of work and relax, is what I'm guessing. Jeanette would attend a Catholic school and was actually bullied by some of her classmates. Not that the bullying was that severe, like this isn't what you'd see in like high school movies when they really need to show that the bully's a bad guy. Not that that makes it better, but still, as some people started a rumor that she was promiscuous. How scandalous. Like, I don't know, I think who cares? Remember, this is the 60s and 70s that all of this is kind of taking place. Times were a little different, but still, just what a stupid rumor. On August 7th, 1972, the now 16-year-old Jeanette DePalma would tell her mother that she was going to hitchhike to her cousin's house, which was about 8, 9, 10 miles away or so from her house. She would say goodbye to her mom, head out the door, and that was the last time Jeanette DePalma would be seen alive. When she hadn't returned by nightfall, the family reached out to her cousin and found out she'd never made it to the house. So they called 911 immediately. And frustratingly, the police came, talked to the DePalmas, and said, since she hasn't been missing for 24 hours, you can't file a missing persons case, which I always thought was like a myth, but evidently, at least in this case, that was true. And not only that, they almost brushed it aside and just said, well, she's a teenager, she probably ran away, or it's just out, doing teenage things. I don't know. I'm not a parent, but even if I thought my child was out, past curfew or whatever, it's now the middle of the night. They were supposed to be back hours ago. Even if I thought and found it more likely that they were out, just doing teenage things, right? Like, I don't know, whatever teenagers do now. I'd still be worried and would appreciate if I could get that missing persons case down in case something bad happens. Like if I cannot reach them or whatever, that's not good. They didn't make it to where they were supposed to be. Jeanette didn't make it to her cousin's house. It's just so infuriating that maybe it at least could have helped find her, or at least get people on the right track, start the search sooner. But unfortunately, until the 24 hours passed, the DePalmas were on their own, and they started searching immediately, going between their house and the house she was going to, searching around, asking around, and after 24 hours, they were able to file that missing persons case and get the police involved, but, who knows what could have been done in those initial 24 hours had the police actually started investigating it at that point. Probably the most frustrating part of this case, truthfully. 6 agonizing weeks would pass with no sign whatsoever of Jeanette. The family was growing frustrated and sad and just wished they could find their daughter, or a trace of her at least. It was as though she vanished into thin air. But still they continued the search and kept trying to find their daughter. That was until September 19th. A dog had returned to its owner with a severed human arm in its mouth. The owner would, rightfully call the police to report this. They would look into it and search the surrounding area, and they would come to find that this arm belonged to Jeanette DePalma. And they determined this because while searching the area around which the dog could have gotten the arm from, they found Jeanette's body. Her remains would be found on a cliff, nicknamed the Devil's Teeth. Now, initial publications in the newspaper and other reports would indicate that there were probable links to occult activity with this crime. It was said that the body was found in a kneeling position, and around her were logs and sticks that were sort of arranged to resemble a coffin-type shape. There were also a bunch of little sticks around the area that were sort of tied together and positioned to look like crosses. Now, the legitimacy of these claims would be called into question, which we'll talk about here in a bit later, but just know for now that the media had this satanic and witchcraft angle, and they were running with it. The Elizabeth Daily Journal wrote at the time of the crime, "Investigation into the death of 16-year-old Jeanette DePalma is focusing on elements of black witchcraft and Satan worship. A review of the death scene photos, according to reports, is leading authorities to believe the girl's death may have been the nature of a sacrifice. Pieces of wood, at first thought to be at the scene by chance, now are seen as symbols. One searcher said 2 pieces of wood were crossed on the ground over her head. More wood framed her body like a coffin. And the following items were located with her at the scene of the crime: tissues, a Vicks inhaler, a small green compact, lipstick, a blue comb, a key, a clear vial with an unknown substance, an eyeshadow box, and then a pair of brown sandals." Now, it's worth noting that the vial of clear substance, Jeanette's mother said that she had a cold at the time and that this was likely medicine, but as far as I can tell to date, it's never been tested what this substance is, or at least following that initial investigation. So maybe if they still have access to a decent sample of that, they could run evidence on it today, but for now, just know it is widely believed that this was medicine. Now, the sandals that were found with her were off of her feet. She wasn't actively wearing them at the time of her death. And in relation to where she was found, the sandals were sort of an oddity. See, many of the police who went up that cliffside said that it would have been very, very hard for her to get up there with those sandals on. Near impossible, as people with hiking boots still struggled. This would be an impressive feat. And going up barefoot would suck, and there was no notable damage on her feet where any of the rock or grass or anything would have got on her, more than it would at that top spot where she was found. So this meant someone likely would have had to carry her up there, which also would have been hard to do because it's hard enough for one person to have scaled this, let alone one person having to hold the weight of another human being. So her getting up there, even though she likely did it in flip-flops, still posed a difficult task. Now, when taken to a coroner, they would determine that the cause of death was likely strangulation. The body was badly decomposed by the time they found it, being exposed to the elements for 6 whole weeks, so they couldn't really determine much else, but it did seem as though strangulation was the only thing that happened to the body. There wasn't signs of anything else happening to her or anything along those lines, and with her arm being found by the dog, that was simply because the body had decomposed enough that the dog was probably able just to get it loose and, run with it. But ultimately, the case goes cold there. All they had really was the date of her disappearance, where she was found, and how she died. There was no other evidence or indicator of who could have done this to Jeanette. But there were a few suspects nonetheless, but they were few and far between. One was a homeless man in the area named Red, who, upon hearing about Jeanette's body being found, fled the area. Police would find him and question him, and ultimately ruled him out as a suspect. It seems far more likely that he fled the area at fear of being accused, which, as we can see, he was. But when police looked into it, they ruled he likely didn't do this. One of the more interesting suspects, though, was that of Richard Cottingham, otherwise known as the Torso Killer. Cottingham was a serial killer who was active in the New York, New Jersey area around this time period. And while he had around 20 confirmed victims, he has admitted to the killing of over 100. And one of these people who he admitted killing to, regardless of the fact that there's no evidence linking them together, is Jeanette DePalma. It was as recently as 2021 that he admitted to killing DePalma. He said that he saw her on the side of the road hitchhiking, that he picked her up, and would go on to take her own life. However, there is a rather disgusting trait among a lot of serial killers in that they often admit to crimes they didn't commit. Why they do this can range anywhere from attention, morbid fun. I don't know. I don't really want to know what they think. They're disgusting. And while I can't say for 100% certainty that this is the case, I can say it looks more like that than otherwise. See, Cottingham was called the Torso Killer because of how horrific his crime scenes were. I'm sure you can imagine earning that nickname leads to some pretty graphic scenes left behind. And DePalma, with the exception of her arm, which was more a result of decomposition than anything the culprit did, was found intact. And just the scene and the nature of the crime, police were pretty well able to rule out Cottingham because it just didn't fit his MO. It was this one case was so different than all the other actual confirmed ones that he had that, well, that's not saying it's impossible that he did it. It's more likely that Cottingham just got some sick pleasure in saying this, as opposed to him actually being the one who did it. Maybe a further investigation will lead to this being the case. We never know. For now, I would say it looks unlikely that it was him. Now, of course, people in DePalma's personal life would also be looked into. Family, friends, her boyfriend, people at school, but all ultimately either had alibis or just didn't fit the build, so they were ruled out for the most part. The big theory, however, going around at that time was that a local coven of witches or Satanists or some other group with occult ties were the ones who did this. I mentioned earlier that she was found in a kneeling position with crosses around her and wood assembled to sort of be like a coffin or shape around her body. Almost none of this is true, or it's a gross exaggeration at best. When part of the DePalma case file was finally released to the public as recently as the 2020s, I believe, it became clear through looking at the photos, which I can't show. I can't show a dead body on YouTube, sorry. You don't want to see that anyways. If you're weird and do that on your free time, I can't stop you. But the crime scene photos would show that there are in fact no crosses around her. There are sticks, sure, I guess, just given that this was an outside cliffside area, but nothing's resembling a cross. She's not kneeling either, like the report says. Instead, her front side is just down instead of kneeling. She was found laying on her stomach, essentially, not in some kneeling, praying position. And there were sticks around her body, but to say that it was in the shape of a coffin is a reach, to put it lightly. Whoever initially said that there were crosses and a coffin shape and that she was kneeling and anything just to make it look as though it was related to some occult crime was either misinformed, spreading misinformation, or was just greatly exaggerating for some reason. And ultimately, this sort of Satanist witchcraft angle to the crime, which most have believed for nearly 40 years now, I feel has largely put a hindrance on any information that could be gained from the case. Who initially leaked this information to the media is unknown. Some believe this could have to do with a cover-up trying to throw the people on a sort of literal witch hunt instead of looking into who actually could have done it. Believe that if you want. I think it was gross negligence and fear given the time that this crime took place. Keep in mind, this is 1972. The Jesus movement is in full swing, which, for those that don't know, given the sort of psychedelic, hippie-fueled 60s, people kind of came back to church in the 70s, I suppose. And with that, many of them became afraid of any sort of satanic behavior or witchcraft or anything, dark magic related, I suppose. And we can see this stretching even into the 80s with the Satanic Panic and whatnot, where people say Dungeons and Dragons, rock music, things like that were satanic. And I can assure you, I am as nerdy as I look. I've played, not much, but I've played a little bit of Dungeons and Dragons. It's pretty fun. I even have my own little guy that I painted up. I'll take a photo of him and put him on the screen here. That's my guy. His name's Gorm. He's a dwarf bard. I don't really have much more to say than that, but I think he's a funny little guy. And I can tell you, playing Dungeons and Dragons, I have never, committed a human sacrifice or anything along those lines. So, and I also listen to a lot of rock, metal music and stuff like that, and that too has never made me commit a human sacrifice. So the Satanic Panic was stupid. Side tangent aside, all of this is to say that given the fears at the time of, people thinking that Satanism was corrupting their children and whatnot, and the youth and everything, and that all these occult and satanic crimes were happening, not to say none were. I mean, obviously, that stuff still happens. But that probably led to a lot of people over-exaggerating and misreporting on this. And of course, the media is going to run with this. If it bleeds, it leads. And if there's a satanic angle to it, it's going to lead even more. So who ultimately is responsible for leaking the sort of witchcraft account? I don't know. But I feel as though it has made the case 10 steps behind where it could have been. It could be just as unsolved regardless, but finding out almost 40 years later that the main angle to the case is actually wrong and misreported is frustrating, to put it lightly. I've said things are frustrated, to put it lightly, with this case a few times now, and ultimately, the case of Jeanette DePalma is saddening more than anything. A young girl's life was taken far too soon, and there's really not much to go off of. There is a Facebook group called Justice for Jeanette DePalma and websites like Mystery NY that have really done a good job talking about this case and keeping it alive and bringing new information to the public eye. And hopefully one day this will be solved, and whoever did this to DePalma will be brought to justice. But as the decades pass, we'll really just have to wait and see. This next case I want to talk about flirts almost with being an urban legend or a cryptid. But rest assured, there is more than enough evidence to prove that this was in fact a real person, which makes it all the more interesting, especially because their identity to date remains unsolved. Now, this story takes place in Switzerland, so rest assured I'm going to mispronounce so much of this. I apologize to any Swedish viewers or any people who know how to pronounce these words. I don't, and I'm sorry, but just know I tried my best. Le Leon, otherwise known as the Ghost of Maules, I believe is how it's pronounced. That's how I'll be pronouncing it. Again, I am sorry. Is an unknown individual from Switzerland. While the first official sighting of Le Leon is not confirmed, it's believed to be 2003, though some say they saw it sooner, some say later. 2003 is the first real date people describe seeing Le Leon. And this sighting, like every other one of this individual, was in a forest outside of Maules, and sightings would be reported periodically until 2013. And what makes Le Leon interesting isn't some tie to a heinous crime or some unexplained event. It's the person themselves. Le Leon was a person who would walk around in the forest. That is how they were seen every single time. No one saw them out of this forest or anything like that. It was just a person who would walk the trails in the forest. Now, what's interesting about that? Well, it's their appearance. See, Le Leon was reported to be a little taller than 6 feet tall, wearing a boiler suit, a camouflage cloak, and a gas mask. Now, outside of their appearance, Le Leon was just a peaceful individual. They would just walk through the forest. In one sighting, a woman even saw them picking flowers. And upon noticing that the woman was watching them, they got up and walked away. Le Leon just really didn't seem to want to be around people. Just seemed to want to mind their own business, not really go near anyone, not interact with anyone, just wanted to wear their outfit and walk through the woods. And of course, it could be a little eerie being in the woods, seeing a person in a gas mask, a camo cloak, and a boiler suit, walking towards you, especially, they were pretty tall. That could be pretty, imposing. I personally would probably think the angel of death had come for me. Le Leon wanted to wear their gas mask and cloak and boiler suit, and frankly, that's fine. It's a little odd, sure, but who am I to judge? I'm sure whoever Le Leon was could see me, in my day-to-day life in a band t-shirt, a flannel, and jeans, like I'm going to a grunge concert in the 90s, and to think that guy's dressed weird. And that's fine, especially since, like I said, they were peaceful. They were just in the woods to walk around. If that's what they want to wear, more power to you. They're not breaking any laws. They're not doing anything wrong. It's a little odd, sure, but really, who cares? Well, a lot of people cared, actually, because it freaked a lot of people out. There are reports of people being with their families and their kids getting scared. That's fair. I'll give them that. But people just saw this figure, and even though they would present themselves as being peaceful and ultimately were peaceful, people had great issue with it. I know, like I said, running into an NPC from Resident Evil would be scary, but if they're not actually doing anything, then like I said, who cares? There were so many calls and reports about Le Leon that the police said they would like to speak to them just to make sure they weren't a threat to public safety or anything like that. Probably asked them to quit wearing the outfit, but, again, they're not breaking any law, so they don't really have to do anything, but this meeting between Le Leon and police would never occur. And in 2013, a photographer would actually get the first ever photo of Le Leon. And to date, this isn't just the first photo, this is the only photo of Le Leon ever captured. The photographer was with his family in the woods when he saw Le Leon coming towards him. He was freaked out, of course, and his kids started getting disturbed, which, again, you would. And Le Leon would just see them, see that they were upsetting the children, and turn around and walk away, back the way they came. And the photographer would pull out their phone and get a photograph of them. This photo would end up being published in the newspaper Le Matin, I'm so sorry, and would actually be a pretty decent sized news story. And it's clear that Le Leon saw this, because shortly after the photograph of Le Leon was published, there in the woods that they were known to walk was a gas mask and a cloak that they would always wear. And accompanying it was a note. Now, this note has been translated into English. If it's a little rough or translates a little crudely, my bad. I'm not multilingual. I'm sorry. But this is pretty well what the note says. Death certificate and testament of the Phantom of Maules. Dear Patrick and Le Matin, not only are you a moron, but you are above all an assassin. You murdered a very harmless being who found in his walks a real therapy of happiness, a cerebral resourcing allowing him to face the responsibilities and the vicissitudes of his normal life, and he had some. The ghost cannot explain this happiness, but you do not seem to know Sacher Masoch. You will discover that it takes everything to make a world. Then you are an assassin of freedoms. To hear you, we find ourselves in the Middle Ages, at the time of witches. Why don't you rise up against the little toads, helmets and hoods, dressed in leather, who backfire on their motorcycles, in these same forests, them in violation? Do they take the time to meditate in front of the little oratory, to ask for a better world? I terrorize children? Make me laugh. Why are they not terrified by the horrors and the crimes, very real these, that they see on television, in the media? Who is in charge of setting the tolerance and freedom button on this company? These beautiful notions benefit more dealers, pimps, burglars, can't say that word, and hooligans. Switzerland is small. Anything that is not in accordance with the garden gnome must be eradicated. I thought during these years, while I was always left alone, until you, that these feelings were evolving. You give me the opposite proof, unfortunately. The phantom disappears. The risk of a beast hunt is too great. It will come back to haunt the narrow minds of your kind, for ultimately, a ghost never dies. So basically, the ghost is saying they did nothing wrong. They were just in the woods wearing what they wanted to wear, and yet they were vilified for it. All they wanted to do was walk around the woods. It gave them peace and comfort and was a sort of therapy. But because they wanted to wear what they wanted to wear, regardless of the fact that they weren't harming anyone, they were basically ran out. And since then, there has been no sighting of Le Leon. Some believe this was someone with a severe skin condition or a deformity that they wanted to hide in all those layers so that they wouldn't be judged for it while walking around the woods, as, like the note says, it brought them peace. But regardless of who they are, they were vilified for basically nothing. Again, I can't say it's not weird that they were out in those woods wearing that. If they were there intentionally trying to scare people, it'd be a different story. But it really does seem as though that's just what they wanted to wear. It's sad, really. And hopefully Le Leon is still out there and is still able to walk those woods, even if they aren't doing it in their traditional attire. Really, it seems as though Le Leon was just someone who wanted to be at peace in nature. And if that's the case, I wish them well. And now let's take a look at the last unsolved mystery we'll be talking about today. That being Jerome of Sandy Cove. The date is September 8th, 1863. The location is Sandy Cove, Nova Scotia, Canada, on the Bay of Fundy. There, a man was seen leaning against a large rock. Now, I'll be honest, right out of the gate, there are discrepancies in this story, most notably being with who actually found this man. Some reports indicate that it was an 8-year-old boy named George Albright, while others say that it was a group of fishermen or a single fisherman, but most reports I've found said it was George Albright, so that will be who we're going with. Though as I said, sources vary. George Cullen Albright, oftentimes referred to as Collie by friends and family, would actually grow up to be a pretty interesting character. As an adult, he would end up living alone, and people would come visit him, sort of like a tourist site, and would oftentimes bring him tobacco from the United States. And not much really seemed to bother him. There was one time a storm blew off the roof to his house completely, and a few days later someone came to check on him just to see how he was doing. And when they did, it was raining that day, and they saw him just still inside the walls of his house, because again, just walls, there's no roof, trying to tend to a fire, all the while rain was just coming down still, sort of putting out the fire, but he just kept stoking it, kept trying to keep it going, and seemed all around cheerful. And at the yearly Arbor Day picnic, children would gather up the remaining food and actually bring it to Collie. But it was just this fun little tradition they had where they wouldn't give it to him unless he came out and sang a song. The words to it being, "Dig my grave narrow and long, put a tombstone to my head, tell my friends that I am lying low." And then they would give him the food. I like this guy. However, side tangent aside, I do want to point out that in this little biography I found of him, it said his father is the one who found the man on the beach, further adding another discrepancy to who actually found him. Regardless of who it was who actually found the man on the beach, what does remain consistent is how he was found. He appeared to be a younger man, somewhere in his early to mid-20s. Next to him was a thing of biscuits, a loaf of bread, and a jug of water. However, he was in a pretty rough state of being. He was shivering as the icy cold water had drenched him, and far more notably, he was missing his legs. It was clear that the loss of his legs had happened recently, not as though, he was still sitting there succumbing to that injury, but somewhere within the last couple years. However, what caused the necessary, what everyone assumed to be, operation was unknown. This man would be taken in by the Albrights for a time and nursed back to health. But while they were trying to nurse him back to health, they wanted to find out who he was. Maybe they could get him home or, send him to where he needs to be sent. But they would come to find out he didn't speak English. Okay, not that big a deal. There was actually a pretty big collection of multilingual people in Nova Scotia. So they brought a good chunk of people in to talk to him to find out what language he speaks so they could communicate with him. However, they would come to find out not only did he not know English, he didn't know Italian, Spanish, French, or Latin. So now the people in Nova Scotia were stumped. He didn't know a decent bit of languages that they could have thrown at him. And when they tried communicating with him, they found he didn't try communicating at all. It wasn't like he was speaking a language they didn't recognize. He wasn't speaking to them in the slightest. No words were coming out of his mouth, except they thought he said one word at one point in time early on into his being taken care of by the Albrights. And they thought he said Jerome. So they started calling this man Jerome. However, it is far more likely this was just like a grunt or groan that he let out. And they were just like, yeah, Jerome sounds right. Because he never tried speaking again. In fact, as so many people were coming to visit him to find out who he was and try and help, he got frustrated and would frequently growl at people. And that was about the extent of his communication. He would just kind of grunt. I thought I saw one report that said he barked at someone. That's interesting. But yeah, it's not just that he didn't speak any language that people in Nova Scotia had that they could recognize. He didn't speak any language whatsoever, it seemed, and he wouldn't utter so much of a word in any language until the day he died. The Albrights eventually found themselves unable to take care of Jerome anymore. He was just another mouth to feed, and they just couldn't afford it. So eventually them and the people of Sandy Cove got together and figured out what to do, and they sent him to the neighboring area of Mettgen. This was a heavily Catholic community, and they did this because, looking at him, they believed he was Italian, and therefore assumed him to be Catholic. So they went, okay, here we go, and just shipped him over there. So they sent him to Mettgen, but they did have a stipend for him where his caretakers would get $2 a week to take care of him, which at the time wasn't awful money. And it was in Mettgen where he would spend the rest of his days, passing away April 15th, 1912, with no one being any closer to figuring out who he was or where he came from than the day he was found at Sandy Cove. There are a few theories as to who Jerome could have been. Some suggest that he was a man who was punished, either by being a deserter in the Civil War or by being a sailor who committed a mutiny, and as punishment for his crimes he had his legs amputated and was basically just abandoned here at Sandy Cove. One theory presented by author Fraser Mooney Jr. in his book, Jerome, Solving the Mystery of Nova Scotia's Silent Castaway, states that in 1859, at Chipman, New Brunswick, located on the opposite side of Fundy Bay, where he was found, a man had had his legs amputated after he had fallen through an icy river, and they had developed gangrene. It is believed that this man was Italian, as following the amputation, he would look down at his legs and cry out "Gamba," which means legs in Italian. And because of that, the people of Chipman began calling him Gamby. That's messed up. Sort of making fun of him for, losing his legs, but whatever. And to make matters more rude, the people of Chipman didn't really want to deal with Gamby anymore. They found him to be a burden. So the theory proposed by Mooney states that they basically paid a sailor or someone to take him away, and that they just went across the bay, dropped him off at Sandy Cove with some water and some bread, and basically said good luck and left. This theory isn't perfect. It calls on a lot of coincidences, but it's not a bad one by any means, and is the more likely one I've heard, as there are records of Gamby existing. Maybe Jerome was really Gamby. And as for the reason as why he never spoke, this could apply to any of the theories, frankly, is because it's possible that he could have suffered some sort of brain damage, damaging the part of his brain that makes it possible for him to engage in and understand in communication and speech. This would be why he wouldn't say anything in any language or even seem to recognize any language spoken to him, because damage had been done to his brain that wouldn't allow him to. Everything would just sound like gibberish to him. Ultimately, whoever Jerome was, be it Gamby, a sailor, a soldier, whoever he was, will likely never be solved. It's just far too removed and just far too small of a case. With all the cases we covered today, hopefully someday they'll be solved. Hopefully we'll know what happened to Jeanette DePalma, and hopefully we'll know who Jerome of Sandy Cove was. But as time passes and dates get further, we really are just at the mercy of time to find out. And that's pretty well going to do it for today's video. I know for returning viewers this video was a little bit different, and I promise I'm working on content more typical of what I usually cover here on the channel, but I really just wanted to talk about these unsolved mysteries because I just found them really interesting. If you liked this type of video though, let me know. If you did, let me know some other stories you'd want me to talk about, other cases to look into. And that pretty well goes for anything. If there's anything you want to see me cover, be it unsolved mystery, analog horror, creepypastas, anything like that, some web series, let me know. I am very, very open to suggestions. I found out about some of my favorite stuff. So my favorite videos I've worked on this channel have been suggestions of you guys. So please always feel free to let me know anything you'd want me to work on. I love hearing about new things and, in the realm of horror and mysteries and whatnot. So I love hearing from you guys. Let me know if there's anything you do want me to cover. Speaking of you guys, thank you all so very much for all the support on the new creepypasta video. It's doing really well. At the time of recording this, it's at 102,000 views, I believe, which is awesome. I did not expect that video to do that well at all. And just, as always, thank you guys for everything. We're at 57,000 subscribers right now, which is unreal. Hopefully we can make it to 60,000 by the end of the year. That'd be really cool, actually. But yeah, just as usual, just wanted to say thank you all so very much for everything. It means a ton, even if I'm not great at expressing it. But yeah, that's going to do it for today. I'm going to get to work on this. I've got a few videos lined up that I'm very, very excited to work on. I'm actually hitting cut on this video, and then between editing times, like on like lunch breaks at work and whatnot, I'm going to be looking into research for the new video because I'm very excited to work on that. It'll also be a little different, I won't lie to you, but it's one I'm pretty excited to make. And then after that, I've got a couple proper Jaybird videos ready. So that was a long tangent for no reason, but just thank you all very much for everything. I won't take up too much of your time anymore, and I hope you all have a great day. Thanks for watching.